As we get another day close to the Hurricanes fully being back, we hear from Rod Brind'Amour as he gives his thoughts on the Four Nations, a possible change in the point system, and where I think the NHL needs to make another change on a Thursday edition of Lockdown Hurricanes.
Your Locked On Hurricanes, your daily podcast on the Carolina Hurricanes. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to a Thursday edition of Locked On Hurricanes, your team every day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Thank you to the Everydayer for making this your first listen of the day. 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, talking everything about your Carolina Hurricanes. I'm your host, Zach Martin. I'm the credentialed Carolina Hurricanes beat writer over at the Hockey Writer. I also do some AHL content over at the Caller Times. Also the co-host of the Surgecast, which is a weekly Carolina Hurricanes podcast, along with all my duties here at Locked On Hurricanes. Like I said at the top of the show, we got a fun Thursday edition of the pod as we get to hear from Rod Brind'Amour in his press conference after practice on Wednesday. Talk about the Four Nations trying to balance the long break that's in between with the guys, some of the guys still being there, and with the rest of the roster. Also they do ask him about the point system, which I'll dive more into in the second part of the show. And I think we should possibly look at a possible revamp of the playoffs, because with the playoffs coming up, after the next 26 games over 52 days, why not visit a possible what should it be? So got a lot of good stuff for this episode. So you know what? Let's not waste any time. Let's jump into the Brind'Amour press conference right now and get his thoughts on the Four Nations and the point system overall.
When you kind of touched on this yesterday, the 1996 World Cup of Hockey, what do you remember kind of about that?
That it was intense. Like, people are like questioning. I remember hearing like, "Oh, I don't know how hard these guys are going to play." I'm like, "Did you remember watching that? Like, you get the best on best. It's vicious. I mean, that's what I remember." And it was everyone going as hard as they can, what you're seeing up now. So it's not surprising.
And the final was a best of three, right? At the end. And
yeah.
Do you wish that kind of maybe they had replicated that for this one, or do you think that might have been a little too much?
Well, the difference is that one they did it right. In my opinion, it was before the season. It was right during training camp, kind of going on. So you had time. And the players were already kind of, instead of doing that training camp with their teams, they were doing it, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So you could allow for a longer tournament, which is what they did. So I think that's in the future the way it should go, because this just dragged on, but there's only been a few games, right? It's just weird how it's worked out. But I don't know. It doesn't matter. One game to take all is kind of special.
And then kind of lastly, they did a 3-2-1 point system, and that's kind of a new thing that maybe we've introduced. How would you feel if the NHL maybe tried to bring that in?
I think it's a great idea, because there's so many games that just go to overtime now. Like, should be maybe rewarded more for doing it, in the regular season or the regular time. I think that's a good idea.
Big thank you to Rod Brind'Amour and the Carolina Hurricanes, as always. And it's very interesting getting his perspective of, from Rod, talking about Four Nations, where, you get that different type of format where you're talking, when he was playing with the World Cup of Hockey and all that stuff, where it was a lot of, preseason, before camp, or was camp essentially. And you go into the season, and then when you get to the All-Star break, it's not as much of a break as stuff like that. So I can see where he's coming from. Like, with the coaches now, they understand that, guys need rest. They're totally fine with that. It's just how long it's been going on too, because you're talking, a few round robin games, and then it's like you have this little bit of a break in between Monday's games, and of course the final being on Thursday. So it's like you try to find that balance of, you don't want to make it too long with like with the person asking the question of a possible best of three, or, it's a one game winner take all, because you don't really want to drag it out too long. You're playing too many extra games where these guys are, a lot of them were ready for a break when they're playing a little bit more hockey. And then, they go right into, getting back into the AHL, games and stuff like that, especially with the Hurricanes. Because you're talking 26 games over 52 days, and, with Jacob Slavin and Seth Jarvis, like, they're playing on Thursday night. At least Jacob Slavin is. We're still waiting on Seth Jarvis if he's playing or not, but they're still playing on Thursday. And then it's like, are they going back to Raleigh, or are they going to meet with the team in Toronto after Thursday night, or are they going to fly out Friday morning and meet the team there? Because, with them, you basically got a day to kind of relax after playing in a final for, the Four Nations, and then it's right back to the grind of the NHL season. But I do see where Rod's coming from as well. It's like, it was before the season, so you can have more time to have more teams, maybe draw it out a little bit longer than instead of trying to fit, a bunch of different round robin games and then a winner-take-all final. Let's just schedule like 2 days before you go right back into a regular season schedule of the NHL. So there's a lot of arguments from both sides, but it's it's interesting getting a perspective of a guy who's been there and done that, playing himself and now being a coach. But the coaches understand too, guys want breaks and stuff like that, and everyone wants breaks. It's a huge opportunity to play for your international team for your country. So, but I don't know. I think they did a good job with this, where it's not an all-star game. It's the Four Nations. They kind of did with the round robins, and now you're winging for a final. Like, could you do it before the season started? Yeah, possibly. But then, you maybe instead of doing it like where you play your games on Sunday, then you're waiting until Wednesday to start it, and then it's done by the next Thursday. Maybe you just have the game start on a Monday and have it done by like that Saturday. That way the rest of the guys still have that whole extra week off if they really want to do that. But also on the side too, you still have the whole rest of the team that's kind of practicing right now. So now you get 4 straight days of practice, which you don't really get a whole lot. So there's a lot of nuances when it comes to that. But they did ask Rod also about the 3-2-1 point system that the Four Nations had. And I'll dive into more why I think this is a good idea for sure. But just on the surface level, and Rod said there's so many games going into overtime now. It's almost like you have, there's not much of the incentive of, let's just win this in regulation. Like, there is incentive there, but it's like, if you're going into overtime, you're kind of like holding off a bit to get into overtime. So at least you're securing yourself a point and not getting, even if you don't get the full 2, at least you get a point with it. But I think, where I think a lot of people are seeing it is, no, if you win a regulation, you get the extra point. Now you might have a little bit more of a stretch of getting away from other teams who, got 0. Now you have 3-0 instead of 2-0, or instead if you still go to, overtime, it's still 2-1, but you're putting more in an incentive to go get that win in regulation, because now instead of getting 2 points, now you're going for the 3. Now you're going to make it where it's, where that extra point on top of instead of getting the 2, now you're getting the 3. I think that's kind of a big thing and stuff like that. But the thing, like, it's not really super new in terms of, was the Four Nations that kind of figured it out. I mean, when you look at, the Professional Women's Hockey League, they've been doing the 3-2-1 system. And of course, they have like, the penalty kill rules, with the jailbreak rule too. Like, if you score on the penalty kill, the power play's over. The other team doesn't still get a power play opportunity. Like, I think that'd be a great rule too if the NHL kind of adopted that, because you see especially with the Canes of Jarvis and Aho and them, they're always scoring on the penalty kill. Like, imagine how much higher the percentage would be for penalty killing across the league, and even for the Hurricanes, because if they're scoring all these shorthanded goals, now they're jailbreaking their guys out sooner, and now you're just bumping your numbers up on the penalty kill. But in terms of rules that should be implemented in the NHL, I think the 3-2-1 system is very interesting. I think it'd be a lot of fun to have. And Rod's right. Like, he thinks it's a great idea, because now you're giving the teams more push to be like, no, let's go get the 3. Let's give them 0, because now we can extend ourselves in our division. Like, say you're playing a division opponent and you beat them in regulation. Now that's 3 points. Now you're extending that gap even farther against them. Let's say if you're first, or you're second and they're third, you get the full 3 points and they get nothing. Now you're really separating yourselves from them. So it does make it very interesting. And like I said, I'll dive more into that 3-2-1 system, here in segment 2, just because I think of what the advantages we can get from that. So stick around, as I will dive more into the 3-2-1 point system and why it will work in the NHL here in a second on a Thursday edition of Locked On Hurricanes. Looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Crackin is a good source of protein with wonderful pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts. Each 1 ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you 10% of your daily value. Plus, they're packed with fiber and better for you unsaturated fats to help keep you feeling fuller longer. Get snacking and get cracking with the snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. Welcome back to segment 2 of Locked on Hurricanes, your team every day. So like I said at the end of segment 1, the reporter was asking her about the 4 nations. I totally agree with it. You're trying to find that balance of how you kind of make that work with scheduling and days off and the stretches in between games. We'll also talk about the 3-2-1 system, and Rod said, perfectly, he thinks it's a great idea. It should definitely be used a lot more often. Now it's like 4 nations did it, but also the PWHL has been doing it as well. And I think this is a system that could really work because with the 3-2-1 system, you're talking about a regulation wins 3 points, overtime where a shootout win is worth 2, a loss in overtime where a shootout is worth 1, and then a regulation loss is worth 0. So you still get the 2 and 1 if you do go into overtime. So that's not really going away necessarily of what it is now. With you win the game in overtime, you get the full 2. If you lose, you get 1 at least. But then if for me, this is more of like rewarding teams who win games in regulation and force the teams who are trying to hope for overtime, try to push to avoid it, because if you lose in regulation, it's 0. But then if you do win the game, you're getting 3 points. So you're almost rewarding the teams who try to push for regulation wins and kind of putting it on the teams who usually try to go for, push for overtime, at least try to get the point. You're still getting a point, but like you're still leaving a lot of points on the table now, because those 2 points could be very huge instead of, the 1 point you lost out on. Now you're losing out on 2 points, and that's very big. And especially the teams losing in regulation, now you're kind of having to push yourselves to try to not lose that game because 3 points are huge. And like I said, if you're talking divisional opponents, where if you win in regulation, now you're putting yourself farther ahead of them because now you're getting the 3 points overall instead of just the 2. And I think the 3-2-1 system also would probably eliminate the overtime merchants of those teams who are always fighting for overtimes, fighting for shootouts, because they're going to get a point. So that's why you see some teams with like records that have 10, 11, 12 overtime losses or shootout losses and getting their way into the playoffs because they had so many points. But when you look at the overall standings, they could be a lot lower than these other teams who had better records, but they didn't have the overtime points that some of these other teams have, where it's like, oh, this team's got 12, 13 points extra because of overtime instead of having all these other extra regulation losses. Because, like with the regulation losses, you don't get anything. But if you stack up enough, overtime losses, like I said, between 10 to 13, that adds up to the rest of the season, going into the playoffs. And that's why you have these teams sneaking in as a overtime point merchant. So this 3-2-1 system, in a way, kind of almost eliminates that, to where it's like, okay, you can try, but let's say these teams are winning 3 points a game now, in regulation, they're still going to put themselves ahead of you, because now you're not going for, oh, well, it's just a point, it's not that big of a deal. But now you're losing out on 2 points. So teams that are consistently winning in regulation are distancing themselves from teams who either are just losing in regulation with a 0, or the guys are always trying to fight for the 1 point. Because now you're spreading that gap out of having a 2-point difference instead of just a point difference. And on paper, that does seem kind of small. Like, okay, it's 1 extra point. It's 2 instead of 1 extra. But if you talk about over an 82 game season, now you're seeing where that adds up over time, to where the team that does get the 3 points are now getting rewarded more for it. And you're not getting, like I said, the teams who are trying to fight for, let's get these like 12, 13 points a season by, going into overtime and shootouts and then still getting our wins. And this is, like I said, it's just a subtle change. And you might not know it at first because it's kind of like, okay, well, it's just, a point. But like I said, over time, this could be to where it's, no, you want to get those regulation wins, because now instead of just getting, oh, we got a point extra. Well, no, now if you win a regulation, you're getting those 2 points that kind of adds up over time. And I think this is something to where you've seen in other leagues they've been doing it. You see in the Four Nations. Now you see why teams are so, why the physicality was there, because now every point matters, every win matters, because we saw it on Monday. If that Canada-Finland game goes into a shootout overtime, if it even just goes into overtime and there's a point at least gained, now Sweden has the opportunity to, if they won, like how they did against the States, then they would have gotten into the final and won on a technicality of the fact that the two teams that they leapfrogged just gained either 2 or 1 points, but if Sweden won, there's 3, they're in. So I think that, especially when you're in the last week of a season, or there's a lot of tight playoff battles, especially for like wild cards or fighting for third in the division or fighting for a division spot. Now you're adding that extra pressure on the teams to go and get that 3 points, because now there's no, it doesn't jam up with a bunch of teams that are getting just 1 point here, 1 point here, 1 point here, 1 point here. Now you want to go get those 3 points, because now it puts you in a better spot overall in your division, and there's more of incentive to go get those points instead of just, okay, well, we got the 1 extra point. No, now you get the 2 extra with just being in regulation. Now you're getting those 3. Like I said, on paper it doesn't sound like a lot, but it puts a lot more implications on those teams to go and win those games. Because let's say it's the last week of the season and you need X amount of points, but now you have to go get all these regulation wins to go get it. Rather than the past, you just had to rely on going into overtime and shootouts. Now it's like, okay, you have like 5 games left, and now you have to go get, let's say, 8 points or something like that, or however you want to break that down. Now you have to go win a bunch, and you have to get yourself into a spot where over 5 games you got to figure out how to get 8 points, and that'll help if you get the regulation wins, because then you're going to shorten that gap a lot quicker than, let's say, you have to go win 4 or 5 to get the 8. Now it's like you can get more of those done with those 3-point wins instead of those 2-point wins, and the teams that are on the bubble are not going to fight more to either get in or stay in or get bumped out. So I think there's a lot of nuance when it comes to just how there's a lot more strategy involved when you get the points involved. But like I said, it's not a so drastic of a change if you go to 3-2-1, but I think it gives teams more incentive to go for the 3 points rather than just try to bank on overtimes and sneaking your way into the playoffs as an overtime merchant, rather than, okay, now you can go get those points because they matter a lot more in the regulation style. So I think it's very interesting if, you see the PWHL use it, Four Nations use it. A lot of people like the idea. Rod even said it's a great idea too. So, in the comments, let me know what you think. Do you think a 3-2-1 point system would work in the NHL if they did adopt it? I believe that it would work phenomenally. We've seen that it works in other leagues. We've seen it work in tournaments. I think that this 3-2-1 system of, like, you're rewarding the teams that win in regulation more, because now you're getting 3 points instead of 2, and now you're having to force those teams who are so used to going into overtime to get the up point at least. Now there has to be more of an urgency on their side to be like, well, yeah, we can go into overtime and get a point. That's great. But if we can go try to get this win, instead of just staying tight and going for overtime, maybe we go and be a little bit more aggressive to go get that win, because now we're getting 3 points instead of just, that 1 extra. Now you're getting that 2 extra points. So especially when you're talking about division titles on the line or wild card races or however you want to look at it, this 3-2-1 system could push a lot of teams to do a lot more and kind of almost, like I said, eliminate those teams that kind of just bank on the overtime points. So it'll be very interesting to see if the NHL does it. I think it'll be soon rather than later, and I believe that it'd be really awesome to see this becoming a system that the NHL does adopt and could see a lot of benefits in terms of, a lot of tight battles, a lot of teams being a little bit more urgent to be aggressive to go get the 3 full points instead of just relying on getting the 2 or the 1 and stuff like that. But like I said, let me know in the comments what you think about that. Now, that would be a great system to have for the 3-2-1, but there was a playoff format that the NHL did have, which I think a lot of people are still clamoring for that to come back. I don't know if it will, but we need to definitely look at a possible playoff format that needs to be revamped and brought back. So stick around as I'll dive into that here in a second on a Thursday edition of Locked On Hurricanes. Welcome to a Thursday edition of Locked On Hurricanes, your team every day. So I said at the end of segment 2 that the NHL maybe needs to go back to a playoff format that's worked in the past. And I think a lot of people are kind of ready for this format to be kind of back, because I feel like over the last few years, you keep getting the same teams in the first round every year, where it's like, okay, Toronto, Boston, or it's Hurricanes, Devils, or Hurricanes, Islanders. I think this might be like the 4th season in a row if it plays out to where it's like Oilers, Kings. And I know Kings fans are absolutely sick and tired of seeing the Oilers in the first round. Because with this, I mean, I understand that they want to have rivalries in the playoffs, because the NHL kind of thrives on it. But I think when you try to manufacture a rivalry, I don't think it's not really there. Like, it's kind of there, but it's not like what you thought it was going to be. Because you do get like, okay, we saw you last year. There's some bad blood from last playoffs. Let's see if it carries over. And sometimes you do get that depending on who's playing who and stuff like that. Like I said, Kings, Oilers. I know Kings fans are tired of seeing those guys. I know as Hurricanes fans are kind of ready to see someone new. Like we've seen the Devils a lot. We've seen the Islanders a lot in the first round. Sometimes we'll see the Rangers, and that's more of like a second round matchup, or we might see Boston in the first round, depending if it's like a wild card situation or however that plays out. But I feel like overall, it's kind of the whole divisional formatting. It's kind of lost its luster in terms of, okay, we want to build rivalries. Because now, it's all high intensity across the board now. I don't think there really is, like, you don't have to force it, because you almost kind of miss the Cinderella runs of teams who are, when you had the 1v8 format of, like, a team like the Edmonton Oilers, when they played the Kings in 2006, they were an 8th seed and made it to the final. The Kings the same way. They were a 6, 7, 8 seed. They made it to a cup final. The Nashville Predators were an 8 seed and knocked out the Blackhawks to go face the Penguins in a Stanley Cup final. So you've seen an 8th seeded team go make a Cinderella run in the NHL playoffs because you got hot at the right time. And this goes into what I think the format should be. When you're talking about a revamp, just go back to the 1v8 system, because you have a lot of teams that I've seen that have better points that still miss the playoffs, because you got these other teams making it in on, being the division matchups are working a certain way, or a wild card works out in a certain way, because they're getting those extra points in these certain games and stuff like that. And you have a lot of teams who probably would have made it in, but didn't, because maybe of divisional formatting and stuff like that. And I understand, like, you kind of want to push for, okay, let's go to division titles because you got 2 versus 3 and stuff like that. But I feel like there's so many teams who are placed in a wild card spot or who miss the playoffs because, let's say, a third place team in a certain division isn't as good as a team who's in a wild card, who just misses out of a wild card spot because maybe their division was too stacked, or just in certain ways. And I feel like that you're kind of missing out on teams who could make things very interesting in the playoffs. And you kind of almost missed that, who's that team that's number 8 that's playing the number 1 team, or 2 versus 7, 3 versus 6, 4 versus 5. Like I said, I understand where they were trying to go in with the divisional formatting of, like, okay, first place gets a wild card, team, and depending on where you are at between the number 1 and number 2 seeds, which wild card team you get. And then it's 2v3 against each other in the divisions. I understand that, but it's almost kind of the point where it's like, like, you're seeing a lot of good teams get knocked out super early, where instead of maybe you might see them get knocked out, but it's a more dramatic of, oh my gosh, this 7th seed just knocked out this 2 seed in the playoffs, or you have the 8 upsetting the 1, or it's just you're kind of missing those oh my goodness moments of lower seeds taking care of business. Yeah, you might have a wild card of being a number 1 seed, like we saw with Florida. They went as a wild card, knocked out Boston, and made it to a final. Yeah, you got that, but you still could get those that win in 1v8. You don't have to manufacture that into a divisional first round, then it's a divisional, final in the second round, and then you get the Eastern Conference final. Like, you see your division every 2 rounds. You don't even see the Atlantic, or let's say a Metro team makes a wild card and they're playing in the Atlantic side of the bracket. You don't see the other teams from the other division until at least the Eastern Conference final, where before with the 1v8 system, you might see them in the first round, you might see them in the second round, and you might see them in the third round. It might be the other division, or it might be your division. But at least you're kind of seeing different teams. You're not playing the same two teams in the first round every single playoff, where it's kind of like, okay, I understand last year was tough, this year's tough, but you're ready to see, you want to see different guys. You want to see different players on other teams in the playoffs, where you might not see that until the conference final. By then, they might be knocked out. So, I would be like, I want to see the Hurricanes take on the Maple Leafs in the second round, or I want to see the Hurricanes take on, Boston in the second round, or Tampa, or let's say Ottawa, or whoever. Or I want to see one of those guys play them in the first round. Maybe you do get Canes Detroit, or Hurricanes Sabres in the first round, or however you want to do it. I feel like you're kind of missing out on seeing different guys for the first two rounds of the playoffs, because you're not, like I said, you're not seeing that until at least the Eastern Conference Final if you're not a wild card team. Because if you're a wild card team, you might see the whole other division for the first two rounds, or you see your whole division until you see the Eastern Conference Final, which is, it's fine in its own right. But I grew up in the, being born in the 90s, I'm used to the 1v8 system, where for a long time you're like, okay, we have this 7th seed who's in the Southeast Division or the Atlantic, or however you want to phrase it. Now we get to see them for a 7-game series, where you might get a Hurricanes, we had Hurricanes Canadians, then we had Hurricanes Devils, then it was Hurricanes Sabres in the playoffs, where you're seeing different teams, where now it's Islanders, Devils, Rangers in the first two rounds every single playoff. And then after you get through them, then you might see the Atlantic team. If the whoever the wild card is to make a run for it, whoever that Atlantic team is that's had a battle through all their Atlantic opponents. It's just, like I said, I understand what the NHL is doing. They're smart. They know what they're doing. But it's like, after a certain while, it's like the divisional forcing of making rivalries in the playoffs kind of runs its course to where it's like, it's okay, it's fine. But like I said, you're seeing the same teams almost every single season in the first two rounds. Like, I kind of feel like, you saw with Four Nations, they changed it with, it's not the All-Star game. They're doing a different point system. Like, why just go back to what was working for the 1v8 system? You're going to see all these, like, the teams are going to get mad at each other regardless, because it's the Stanley Cup final, but at least it's organic. It's more, built up, not just, okay, we're going to force you to do divisional rounds and then see the other division in the Eastern Conference Finals. Like, no, you might have teams who might not like each other during the regular season, or, do have the instant, that playoff rivalry already, but it's not forced. It's more of an organic thing. So if you ask me, I kind of wish we would go back to the 1v8 system instead of having these divisional couple rounds, and then it's whoever in the Eastern Conference Final. So let me know in the comments what you think. Do you like the divisional formatting that they do now in the NHL, or do you feel like they should go back to the 1v8 system, where it's, hey, you get in by points and that's it, where you finish the top 8 in the conference, that's your seed, that's it. We move on, 1 versus 8, 2 versus 7, 3 versus 6, and then 4 against 5. So let me know what you think. Would you rather have the divisional formatting, or would you go back to the 1v8 system? But guys, that will do a Thursday edition of Locked On Hurricanes. Thank you for making your first list today. For your second list today, well, why don't you check out Locked On Fantasy Hockey. Become a fantasy hockey expert every day, from tips, from steal and flip. You can check that out on all podcast platforms or on YouTube. If you want to keep up with me, I'm at OneShoeZach on X. The podcast is LO_Hurricanes. I'm also on Blue Sky at the Zachary Martin. I do have link trees in both of my bios, where you can find my articles at the Hockey Writers or thehockeywriters.com. Also my AHL content at thecaldertimes.com. If you want to check out my other podcasts, well, it's the Searchcast on all podcast platforms and on YouTube. For this show, Spotify, Google, Apple, iHeartRadio. Subscribe, follow, leave a 5-star rating and review. I might just read it on the podcast. For YouTube, well, it's Locked On Hurricanes. Subscribe, hit the bell notification so you don't miss a show. Hit the thumbs up to let me know if you like the show as well. And like I said in the comments, how do you feel about the NHL going to a 3-2-1 system? And how do you feel about the playoff format? Should it stay divisional, or should we go back to the V8. But hope everyone enjoyed the Thursday edition of Locked On Hurricanes. Hope everyone enjoys their Thursday and watching the Four Nations final between U.S. and Canada. But as always, until next time, let's go Canes.